It was the 5th of October, 2022, and smoke was rising over one of the most sacred places on Earth. A fire, deliberately set, tore across the grassy slopes of Rano Raraku, the extinct volcanic crater on Easter Island where nearly every one of the world's famous Moai statues had been carved from volcanic rock almost 1,000 years ago. The blaze burned through more than 100 acres in a matter of hours, and by the time it was contained, more than 100 statues had been scorched black by the flames. The president of Rapa Nui's Council of Elders, Carlos Edmonds, said he began crying the moment he heard the news, describing the feeling as if his own grandparents had been burned alive. The mayor of the island called the damage irreparable, explaining that the extreme heat had cracked the ancient volcanic stone in ways that could never be undone, accelerating a process that would eventually turn solid rock into sand. UNESCO rushed emergency funding to assess statues that had stood through 1,000 years of wind, rain, and isolation, only to be critically injured in a single afternoon by human carelessness. For the first time in generations, the world was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Moai are not indestructible monuments frozen safely in the past. They are fragile, finite, and disappearing. And if nobody acted quickly to document what remained, entire chapters of that history could vanish before they were ever fully understood. That fire lit a fuse, not of flame, but of urgency inside the archaeological community. Researchers realized that if statues could be destroyed in an afternoon, the world needed a complete, precise, permanent digital record of every visible detail on every Moai left standing before fire, erosion, tourism, or the rising ocean took anything else. That urgency is what eventually led, 3 years later, to one of the most important technological breakthroughs in the modern study of Rapa Nui. And it is a very different story than the one currently circulating across parts of the internet, claiming artificial intelligence has uncovered secret underground chambers and buried apocalyptic warnings beneath the statues. Those claims are fabricated, built around invented research institutions and quotes that do not exist. What actually happened in 2025 did not need to be exaggerated. The real findings were dramatic enough on their own, and in some ways, far more meaningful than anything a manufactured mystery could invent. Let's start with why this island has captivated human imagination for centuries in the first place. Rapa Nui, known to most of the world as Easter Island, sits in the middle of the South Pacific, more than 2,000 miles from the nearest continent, making it one of the most isolated inhabited places on the entire planet. Polynesian voyagers reached its shores sometime around the 13th century, navigating open ocean, using nothing but stars, ocean swells, bird migration patterns, and generations of accumulated seafaring knowledge passed down without a single written map. What they built there over the following centuries still defies easy explanation. Close to 1,000 Moai statues, carved from compressed volcanic ash called tuff, were raised across the island's coastline, most facing inland toward the villages they were believed to protect and watch over. Some stand more than 30 feet tall once you account for the portion buried beneath the soil. The largest unfinished statue still lying in the quarry, had it ever been completed and raised, would have stood taller than a 6-story building and weighed well over 140 tons. Nobody knows for certain why it was abandoned mid-carve, frozen in stone exactly where the last chisel strike landed, one of 100 small mysteries the island has simply refused to explain. For most people who have only ever seen photographs, the Moai are simply heads staring out from grassy hillsides with heavy brows, long noses, and solemn expressions. That image is one of the most persistent misconceptions in modern archaeology, and it deserves to be corrected clearly, because it shapes almost everyone's first impression of the island. The statues are not heads. They are complete figures, full bodies with torsos, arms, and hands resting gently against their stomachs. And centuries of erosion, soil accumulation, and shifting volcanic earth have simply buried the lower 2/3 of many of them over time. This was not some shocking discovery unveiled for the first time in 2025. Archaeologists, most notably the long-running Easter Island Statue Project, led for decades by researcher Jo Ann van Tilburg, had already carefully excavated several statues down to their bases years earlier, revealing full torsos and, in some cases, faint petroglyphs carved into the buried stone, symbols connected to canoes, sea creatures, and ancestral ritual practice. What changed in 2025 was not the discovery that bodies existed beneath the surface. What changed was the scale, speed, and precision with which new technology could now document that entire reality across the whole quarry and much of the island at once, without a single shovel disturbing the ground. There is another layer to this that rarely makes it into the sensational headlines, and it involves the statue's eyes. Most Moai standing today have hollow eye sockets, blank and staring, which is part of why they look so eerie in photographs. But excavations decades ago recovered fragments of white coral and red scoria that once fit into those sockets as inlaid eyes. giving the statues a startlingly lifelike gaze when they were first completed and ceremonially installed. Researchers believe the eyes were only fitted once a statue reached its final platform, as part of a ritual that symbolically brought the figure to life to watch over the community. Many Moai also once wore massive cylindrical stone hats called pukao, carved from a completely different reddish-colored volcanic rock, quarried from a separate site on the far side of the island, meaning entire additional networks of labor were required just to produce and transport the headwear alone. And carved wooden tablets found on the island bear a script called Rongo Rongo, rows of tiny glyphs that remain one of the only undeciphered writing systems in the world today. Unlike the invented protoscript claims currently circulating in fabricated online videos, Rongo Rongo is real. Its symbols are documented. And after more than a century of genuine effort by professional linguists, nobody has definitively cracked what it says. That is an actual unsolved mystery hiding in plain sight, requiring no invented chambers to make it compelling. In the months following the 2022 fire, a research team led by anthropologist Carl Philip Lipo of Binghamton University began an ambitious project to build the most complete digital record of Rano Raraku that had ever existed. Rather than ground-penetrating radar or invasive excavation, their method relied on something more elegant and ultimately more revealing. Researchers flew drones over the quarry and captured more than 11,600 overlapping photographs from every conceivable angle, low sweeping passes across the crater floor, high aerial shots capturing the full landscape, close-range images of individual carvings still half embedded in bedrock. Using a technique called structure for motion photogrammetry, powerful software stitched those thousands of images together into a single, continuous, three-dimensional model of the entire quarry, accurate down to fine surface texture. For the first time, researchers, and eventually the public around the world, could examine hundreds of Moai in every stage of production, from rough outlines barely separated from the surrounding rock to nearly finished figures ready for transport, all mapped with a level of precision that would have taken a physical survey team many years to achieve by hand, and that no longer depended on statues surviving untouched by fire, weather, or time. What the completed model revealed, published in the scientific journal PLOS One in late November 2025, was a genuine surprise that reshaped decades of assumptions. For most of the 20th century, the dominant theory held that Rapa Nui society, despite being organized into small competing family clans, must have functioned under some kind of centralized authority to produce something as monumental as nearly 1,000 statues. Coordinating quarrying, carving, transport, and final placement of multi-ton figures across an entire island seemed to demand strict top-down planning, most likely under a powerful ruling class. The new three-dimensional analysis told a very different story. The quarry was not a single unified workshop. It was dozens of separate work areas, spatially distinct from one another, each cluster showing its own stylistic quirks, its own carving techniques, and its own pace of production. The Moai, it turns out, were not the product of one ruling elite commanding labor from above. They were the product of numerous independent groups, each competing, cooperating, and quietly borrowing ideas from their neighbors, creating a patchwork of carving traditions spread across the same sacred volcanic crater. Lipo described the quarry as something close to an archaeological wonderland, a place where researchers can watch an entire society's creative process, frozen mid-motion across centuries, a level of insight the fire nearly took away from the world entirely. To appreciate how significant this reversal was, it helps to remember how long researchers had been trying to answer the same question using far more limited tools. In the 1950s, the Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl, famous for his Kon-Tiki raft voyage, organized expeditions to Rapa Nui and popularized theories involving South American influence and large-scale coordinated labor gangs, dragging statues on wooden sledges, theories that shaped public imagination for decades, even as later evidence undermined them. Van Tilburg's own statue project, running for more than 3 decades, painstakingly cataloged and measured close to 900 individual Moai across the island by hand, an extraordinary feat of patient fieldwork that laid the groundwork for everything that came after. What the 2025 drone model did was not replace that work. It extended it, taking documentation that once required a research career to compile at survey-level detail and rendering it complete, searchable, and permanently preserved down to the centimeter, insurance against the next fire, the next storm, or the next act of vandalism. This finding matters more than it might first appear on the surface. It suggests that monumental architecture, the kind of achievement historians have long assumed requires kings, priests, or rigid centralized bureaucracies, can also emerge naturally from decentralized cooperation among small, autonomous communities working side by side. It reframes Rapa Nui not as a strict hierarchy obsessed with monument building under a single all-powerful ruler, but as a loose, dynamic network of families competing for prestige, each one determined to carve their own legacy into the same mountain their neighbors were also shaping. In a very real sense, the Moai were not built by a kingdom issuing orders. They were built by a society of neighbors, each trying to honor their ancestors and outdo the last generation's achievement. And their quiet, distributed competition left behind one of the most extraordinary collaborative art projects in human history. But the quarry model was only the beginning of what 2025 confirmed. Just weeks before the Binghamton study was formally published, researchers revisited something that sounds almost too strange to be true, and yet lines up precisely with what the Rapa Nui people have insisted for generations. Their oral tradition holds that the Moai did not need to be dragged across the island on logs, sledges, or rollers at all. According to ancestral memory passed down for centuries, the statues walked. For a long time, outside researchers dismissed this as folklore, a poetic way of describing some unknown and long-forgotten transport method. Then, building on earlier, small-scale experiments from more than a decade prior, a team including LiPo tested the idea again in October 2025, using full-scale concrete replicas engineered with the exact same center of gravity, base curvature, and forward lean as the real statues. With a modest group of people pulling ropes attached at precise points along the statue's sides, they rocked the replica forward in a controlled side-to-side motion, and it walked upright, step by step, across open ground. No log rollers, no wooden sledges, no massive coordinated labor force numbering in the hundreds. The statue's own design, top-heavy with a slightly forward-leaning posture, made the walking motion not just possible, but genuinely efficient, requiring far fewer people than any competing theory had ever proposed. Think about what that really means. For nearly 2 centuries, outside researchers speculated endlessly about levers, wooden rollers, massive sledges, and enormous coordinated labor forces to explain how statues weighing 10, 20, even 80 tons could travel miles from the quarry to their final ceremonial platforms. The entire time, the answer had been sitting in plain sight, told directly by the descendants of the very people who built them. And it took modern engineering, careful physics, and full-scale replica testing to prove that the oral history was, essentially, exactly right all along. It stands as one of the more quietly humbling moments in modern archaeology. A reminder that dismissing indigenous knowledge as simple myth can cost researchers decades of unnecessary guesswork, when the truth was being spoken aloud the entire time. If the quarry discovery reframed how the Moai were carved, and the walking studies reframed how they were moved, a third major piece of research reframed something even more fundamental about the island: why the civilization that built them was long believed to have destroyed itself. For most of the 20th and early 21st centuries, the dominant narrative about Rapa Nui, popularized widely through books including Jared Diamond's best-selling account of societal collapse, described the island as a cautionary tale of ecological suicide. According to this telling, the Rapa Nui people cut down every tree on the island in an obsessive frenzy to move their statues, triggered catastrophic ecological collapse, descended into internal warfare and starvation, and saw their population crash from many thousands down to only a few thousand survivors long before Europeans ever arrived on their shores. It became one of the most widely repeated environmental parables in modern popular science, cited endlessly in books, documentaries, and classrooms as proof of what happens when a society overexploits its own environment. An ancient DNA study published in September 2024 in the journal Nature quietly dismantled that entire story at its foundation, and its findings continue to reshape scientific understanding through 2025. By sequencing a genetic material recovered from the remains of individuals who lived on the island across many generations, researchers found no evidence whatsoever of a dramatic population crash before European contact. Instead, the genetic record showed a population that grew steadily and consistently for centuries, right up until outside contact brought devastating disease, slave-raiding expeditions, and colonial disruption in the 18th and 19th centuries. The so-called collapse was not self-inflicted ecological suicide, occurring centuries before Europeans arrived. It was largely a consequence of what happened after foreign ships showed up on the horizon. The island's forests likely did decline over time, partly through land clearing for agriculture and partly through invasive rats, which stowed away on the original voyaging canoes and steadily devoured seeds, preventing the forest from regenerating naturally. But the people themselves did not vanish in some dramatic, self-destructive spiral of warfare and famine. They adapted, they persisted, and they kept building right through the centuries that outside narratives insisted were defined by collapse. Put those 3 findings together, and a very different picture of Rapa Nui emerges than the one most people grew up believing from documentaries and history books. Not a doomed society that annihilated itself through obsession and reckless excess. Not a mysterious, lost civilization wiped out entirely by its own hubris. A resilient, inventive, decentralized community of seafaring families who organized themselves without kings or centralized rulers, who solved an extraordinary engineering problem using physics they understood intuitively through generations of trial, error, and inherited knowledge, and who continued to grow and adapt for centuries until an outside world arrived uninvited and disrupted everything that came before. That is not a lesser story than the one about ecological collapse and buried secrets. It is arguably a far more remarkable one, precisely because it is true, and because it survived being buried under 2 centuries of outside speculation, colonial narratives, and modern misinformation designed more for viral engagement than for accuracy. None of this means the island has run out of real dangers, or that there is nothing left to genuinely worry about. There is a documented threat facing the Moai right now, and unlike buried chambers or invented ancient warnings, this one is measurable, published, and already unfolding in real time. In August 2025, researchers published detailed modeling predicting that rising sea levels driven by climate change could allow storm-driven waves to reach and damage Ahu Tongariki, the largest ceremonial platform on the entire island and home to 15 of its most iconic standing moai, as early as the year 2080. The same modeling suggested that up to 51 significant cultural and archaeological sites scattered across Rapa Nui could be affected by encroaching seawater within the coming decades. These are not statues threatened by some invented underground plot dreamed up for a viral video. They are statues genuinely threatened by the ocean itself, by a changing climate system moving faster than the platforms built to honor the island's ancestors can realistically be reinforced or relocated. The modeling accounted for storm surge combined with projected sea level rise, and found that some of the same coastal platforms already battered by past storms, including damage recorded in earlier decades that forced conservators to reinforce foundations, sit only a few meters of elevation above where waves could realistically reach within this century. For statues that took independent workshops years to carve and entire communities to walk into place, the idea that a single severe storm season decades from now could undo what 1,000 years of isolation could not is a sobering thought, and one grounded entirely in published climate science rather than speculation. That is the part of this story that deserves real, immediate urgency, because it is happening in the present tense, not buried 1,000 years in the past, waiting to be decoded. The Rapa Nui community today, the direct living descendants of the people who quarried, carved, and walked every one of these figures into place, are watching genuine existential threats close in on their most sacred cultural sites, from arson and wildfire to rising water. And they are the ones leading serious conversations about how to protect what remains, whether through engineered coastal defenses, careful relocation of especially vulnerable statues, or some combination of both approaches. Some moai have already needed to be moved or reinforced in past decades because of coastal erosion, and researchers now warn that without meaningful intervention, platforms that have stood proudly for centuries could face irreversible damage within the lifetime of children being born on the island today. There is something worth sitting with in how this entire story has unfolded across just a few remarkable years of discovery and near loss. Artificial intelligence and advanced photogrammetry did not uncover a secret prophecy or a buried warning meant for the modern world. What they did was arguably far more valuable. They gave researchers the ability to process an overwhelming volume of physical evidence, more than 11,000 photographs, minute surface details captured across hundreds of statues, subtle stylistic variations invisible to the naked eye during any ordinary walking survey, and compress what would have taken years of manual analysis into a matter of weeks. That capability did not invent brand new mysteries out of thin air. It resolved genuinely old ones, correcting assumptions that had gone unchallenged for generations simply because nobody previously had the tools or the urgency created by fire and rising tides to test those assumptions properly. It is worth pausing to ask what all of this means for how discoveries like this one get communicated to the public going forward. For every legitimate breakthrough, the quarry model, the walking statue experiments, the genetic research overturning the collapse myth, there is a flood of manufactured content online claiming artificial intelligence has uncovered secret underground chambers, ancient tsunami warnings, or lost civilizations hiding forbidden knowledge sealed beneath the moai. Search for Easter Island discoveries online today, and you will quickly find dramatic headlines describing sealed vaults, catastrophic flood carvings, and quotes attributed to scientists and research institutions that simply do not exist, all engineered purely to generate views, rather than to inform anyone watching. It is a useful reminder that in an era when real archaeological breakthroughs are genuinely happening at an accelerating pace, thanks to tools like drone photogrammetry and machine learning, it has never been more important to check what is actually published in respected peer-reviewed journals against what has simply been engineered to sound sensational. The real story, it turns out, rarely needs exaggeration to feel extraordinary. The Rapa Nui people themselves have been consistently vocal about how they want their heritage treated in this new era of rapid technological discovery, and their voice deserves to be centered rather than treated as an afterthought. Their ancestors are not a puzzle to be solved for entertainment, nor a source of clickbait built around invented doomsday warnings. The statues are living cultural heritage, connected to a community that still exists on the island today, still practices traditions tied directly to these figures, and still holds a direct, unbroken ancestral claim over how this history should be studied, protected, and shared with the wider world. When Carlos Edmonds said the 2022 fire felt like watching his own grandparents burn, he was describing exactly that relationship. Not metaphorical distance from ancient history, but a living, present tense connection to figures many outsiders still mistakenly treat as disconnected relics. Indigenous leaders on the island have repeatedly asked that new research be conducted in partnership with, rather than simply about, the Rapa Nui community, and that findings be communicated responsibly rather than sensationalized purely for algorithmic engagement. That single request, respect the people this history actually belongs to, deserves just as much attention as any drone survey or genetic study making headlines. So where does that leave us? The Moai are not hiding secret chambers built to contain something ancient and dangerous, and there is no lost warning encoded 1,000 years ago, waiting for modern instruments to translate it. What they actually represent, based on everything the published evidence supports, is something quietly more impressive than any manufactured mystery. Proof that a small, isolated community of seafaring families, without centralized rulers, without metal tools, without the wheel, working independently across dozens of separate scattered workshops, engineered a transportation method so effective it allowed statues weighing many tons to walk themselves across miles of rugged volcanic terrain using nothing but rope, coordinated rhythm, and a deep intuitive understanding of physics passed down through generations. Proof that a civilization written off for over a century as history's most famous cautionary tale of self-destruction was, according to its own genetic record, thriving and growing steadily right up until the moment outside contact changed everything, sometimes catastrophically. And proof that even now, in an age of drones, machine learning, and three-dimensional modeling, the most powerful thing these tools can do is not manufacture mystery out of nothing. It is finally listened carefully enough to what the physical evidence and the descendants who have carried this story faithfully for centuries have been saying all along. The real threat facing the Moai today is not buried underground, waiting patiently in some sealed chamber. It is rising from the ocean, measured in centimeters of sea level increase per decade, and it can arrive as suddenly as a match struck in dry grass on an October afternoon. It is a threat that modern technology can help researchers predict and document, but cannot alone prevent. That responsibility falls to all of us collectively, not to some ancient warning waiting patiently to be decoded from stone, but to a very present-day choice about whether we act quickly enough to protect what has already survived nearly 1,000 years of wind, isolation, colonization, and now, fire and flood. The Moai have stood through storms, through disease brought by outsiders, through centuries of speculation about who built them and why, and through a single reckless afternoon in October of 2022 that came far too close to erasing pieces of that history forever. Whether they continue standing through the next century may depend less on what artificial intelligence can uncover about their past, and more on what we choose to do, right now, with everything it has already shown us. If this story taught us anything, it is that the biggest discoveries are not always the ones engineered to frighten us into clicking. Sometimes, the biggest discovery is realizing that the people who have lived somewhere for nearly 1,000 years already knew the answer the entire time, and that all our advanced technology finally did was catch up to them just in time to help protect what remains before the next fire, the next storm, or the next rising tide takes it away for good. Every drone flight, every cataloged statue, every gene sequenced from ancient bone is, in its own quiet way, an act of remembrance for a community that refuses to let its ancestors be reduced to either a punchline about ecological ruin or a prop in someone else's manufactured horror story. Subscribe to the channel for more real stories from the frontier of archaeology, where the truth, it turns out, is almost always more fascinating than the fiction built carelessly around it.